In March 1945, the Allied armies were closing in on the industrial heart of Nazi Germany, pushing through a landscape scarred by years of total war. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth, cordite, and diesel exhaust, as columns of tanks and trucks ground forward under low, gray skies. The Rhine River lay ahead like a final, formidable barrier, a wide, fast-flowing moat that had protected the German homeland for centuries. Crossing it intact, before the enemy could regroup and destroy every bridge, would decide how quickly the war ended and how many more lives it would claim. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Reims, France, General Dwight D. Eisenhower carried the heaviest burden of any commander in history. His office was a hive of controlled chaos. Staff officers hurried in and out with fresh intelligence reports. Maps covered every wall, and the constant clatter of typewriters mixed with the low murmur of urgent telephone conversations. Eisenhower sat at the center of it all, calm and deliberate, chain-smoking as he weighed every decision against the lives of millions of soldiers and the fragile unity of the Allied coalition. His strategy was a broad-front advance. No dramatic thrusts, no high-risk gambles that could leave a flank exposed or waste precious resources. Caution, coordination, and overwhelming logistical superiority would win the war, not brilliance alone. The priority of the moment was Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery's meticulously planned Operation Plunder, a massive set-piece assault across the lower Rhine near the town of Wesel. Montgomery demanded and received vast quantities of fuel, ammunition, bridging equipment, and airborne support. His operation would feature thousands of paratroopers, naval landing craft, and one of the largest artillery barrages of the war. It was textbook perfection, politically necessary to give the British a leading role, and designed to minimize casualties through sheer weight of preparation. Supplies poured north to Montgomery's 21st Army Group, while other armies were told to consolidate and wait. Far to the south, in the muddy hills of the Eifel and the Palatinate, Lieutenant General George S. Patton's Third Army attacked with a very different philosophy. Patton's headquarters moved constantly, a restless caravan of jeeps, command trailers, and radio vans splashing through rain-soaked roads. Patton himself was unmistakable, tall, erect, his polished helmet gleaming, ivory-handled revolvers at his hips, face etched with the lines of a man who had spent a lifetime preparing for war. He believed in speed, aggression, and unrelenting pressure. To Patton, war was not a science of careful calculation, but an art of instinct and audacity. Hesitation gave the enemy time to recover. Boldness forced him to react and crumble. Patton's soldiers were living proof of that doctrine. The Third Army had already written itself into legend. The lightning relief of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, the headlong dash across France the previous summer that outran its own supply lines. Now, in the cold spring of 1945, they faced the Siegfried Line, the infamous west wall of concrete dragon's teeth, pillboxes, minefields, and barbed wire that stretched along Germany's western border. The ground was a quagmire. Tanks bogged down to their bellies in mud, engines roaring helplessly while crews shoveled frantically to free them. Infantrymen advanced on foot, soaked to the skin, fingers numb around frozen rifle bolts, breath fogging in the chill air. At night, German flares drifted slowly over ruined villages, casting long shadows across cobblestone streets littered with rubble and abandoned equipment. Supply shortages bit deep. Because Montgomery's operation had priority, Patton's divisions often ran on fumes. Fuel convoys arrived late or not at all. Artillery ammunition was strictly rationed. Patton raged privately in his diary and in heated phone calls with his superior, General Omar Bradley of the 12th Army Group. He saw Montgomery's deliberate style as the antithesis of everything he believed in, and the political favoritism grated on his fierce American pride. Yet amid the hardship, opportunity appeared. Frontline reconnaissance reported that German resistance was disintegrating faster than anyone at Schaeff had predicted. After the failure of the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's armies in the West were exhausted, short of fuel, ammunition, and fresh troops. Units surrendered by the thousands, hands raised, faces hollow with defeat. Bridges over smaller rivers were sometimes captured intact because the defenders fled before engineers could blow them. And along the Rhine itself, the pattern repeated. Most bridges destroyed, but the East Bank defenses were thin, improvised, and poorly coordinated. Patton's sharp eyes spotted the gap. South of Mainz, near the quiet town of Oppenheim, the Rhine narrowed slightly and the current was less ferocious. The West Bank was already in American hands, and scouts reported only light, disorganized opposition on the far side. No heavy fortifications, no prepared artillery positions. A surprise crossing there, launched immediately with whatever boats and rafts could be scraped together, might succeed before the Germans realized what was happening. If it worked, Third Army could establish a bridgehead deep in the enemy rear, unhinge the entire Rhine defense, and race into central Germany weeks ahead of schedule. Doctrine strictly forbade such a move. Eisenhower's orders were clear. Clear the west bank of the Rhine, consolidate positions, and support Montgomery's main effort in the north. No unauthorized crossings were permitted. A premature assault without massive engineering support, air cover, and stockpiled supplies risked disaster. An isolated bridgehead cut off and destroyed, divisions mauled, and the broad front strategy disrupted at the worst possible moment. Headquarters demanded detailed plans, rehearsals, and approval from the top. Instinct and speed had no place in the official playbook. Patton's corps commanders sensed his restlessness. The most loyal was Major General Walton Walker, commander of Essex Corps, a stocky, tough Texan nicknamed Bulldog by his men. Walker had executed Patton's most impossible orders with grim determination, and he shared his chief's belief that the Germans were on the ropes. In late-night conferences under canvas, lit by hissing gasoline lanterns, Walker urged action. "Give us 24 hours, General, and we'll have infantry across in assault boats. The Krauts won't know what hit them." On the front lines, the human cost of delay was felt in every foxhole. In the 5th Infantry Division, a young lieutenant named Tom Harlan led a rifle platoon that had been reduced to half strength by weeks of constant fighting. They sheltered in the cellar of a half-collapsed farmhouse outside Koblenz, sharing cold K rations by candlelight while rain drummed on the ruined roof above. Harlan's men were exhausted, their uniforms caked with mud, boots rotting from constant wet. "If we sit here waiting for Monty's big show," Harlan told his sergeant, "Jerry gets time to bring up reserves and dig in deeper along the river. That means more of us don't go home." The sergeant nodded silently, cleaning his Garand rifle with a rag that had long since turned black. Patton wrestled with the decision alone, in his trailer late at night, pipe smoke curling around the map table. He respected Eisenhower, admired him even, remembering their friendship from earlier days. But he believed Ike had become trapped by the caution of high command, paralyzed by politics and logistics. "Ike sees the whole theater," Patton thought. "I see the enemy breaking." Doubt gnawed at him. One failed crossing, one repulse, and his career would end in disgrace. He would be relieved of command, sent home in quiet disgrace while others finished the war. Yet if he succeeded, the Rhine barrier would collapse prematurely, saving countless lives and shortening the war. Finally, he acted. Orders went out to advance aggressively to the Rhine and conduct active reconnaissance of possible crossing sites. The language was careful, no direct mention of an immediate assault, but the intent was unmistakable to men who knew Patton's mind. Divisions surged forward, bypassing strong points, accepting risks to maintain momentum. Then came the dangerous question itself. In a carefully worded message routed through Bradley to Eisenhower, Patton asked for freedom of action. If a crossing opportunity presented itself unexpectedly, could Third Army seize it without waiting for formal approval and reallocation of supplies? Phrased as a respectful inquiry, it was in reality a challenge to the entire cautious structure of Allied planning, a request to bend the rules of war at the critical moment. The message reached Schaeff like a live grenade. Eisenhower read it in silence, the room around him falling quiet as aides waited for his reaction. Trust Patton's genius one more time, or enforce discipline and doctrine? The question hung in the smoke-filled air, threatening to reshape the final campaign. But when Patton posed his question, the rules of war itself began to bend. The Third Army moved forward with the relentless energy that had become its signature. Divisions pushed east toward the Rhine through a landscape that seemed designed to punish every step. Spring rains had turned the roads into rivers of mud, deep enough to swallow a jeep's wheels and stall even the heaviest tanks. Sherman tracks churned the earth into a viscous slurry that clung to everything, adding hundreds of pounds to each vehicle and slowing advances to a crawl. Crews worked through the night with shovels and tow cables, cursing under their breath as engines overheated and radiators boiled in the cold air. Infantrymen marched alongside, boots making sucking sounds with every step, uniforms soaked through despite raincoats and ponchos. Patton drove the pace personally. He appeared unannounced along the muddy tracks in his open command jeep, standing tall despite the downpour, barking encouragement and threats in equal measure. "Keep moving, damn it! The enemy is more tired than you are." His voice carried over the roar of engines and the distant thump of artillery. Soldiers who had been ready to collapse found new strength when they saw Old Blood and Guts himself sharing their misery, face streaked with mud, eyes burning with that familiar intensity. At headquarters, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Maps on the folding tables were updated hourly, with grease pencil marks showing the latest gains. Patton stood over them with his corps commanders, pipe clenched between his teeth, tracing possible routes to the river with a gloved finger. General Walton Walker reported that the 80th Infantry Division had seized high ground overlooking the Rhine Valley near Oppenheim, capturing several hundred prisoners in the process. The Germans had fled so quickly they left hot coffee on their stoves and half-eaten meals on the tables. Walker's voice was matter of fact, but his eyes gleamed. "They're breaking, sir. We hit them again tomorrow and they'll run all the way to Berlin." Patton nodded, but inside he wrestled with growing impatience. His dangerous question had been sent up the chain to Eisenhower 2 days earlier, routed through Bradley for political cover. No answer had come yet. Every hour of delay allowed the Germans time to blow more bridges, rush reinforcements to the East Bank, and organize whatever defenses they could muster. Time was bleeding away, and with it the fleeting opportunity he had spotted. At Schaeff and Reims, the debate raged behind closed doors. Eisenhower sat at the long conference table, surrounded by his senior staff, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the scratch of pens on paper. Reports from Patton's sector showed impressive gains, but they also highlighted the risks, stretched supply lines, exhausted troops, and the ever-present danger of a sudden German counterattack. Montgomery's representatives argued strenuously that any diversion of resources south would jeopardize the main crossing in the north. The British Field Marshal himself sent a pointed message reminding everyone that Operation Plunder remained the decisive effort. Eisenhower listened calmly, asking quiet questions, weighing political necessity against military reality. Bradley, caught in the middle as always, defended Patton without fully committing. "George is pushing hard, Ike. He thinks the Germans opposite him are on the verge of collapse. If he's right, a quick crossing could unbalance their entire Rhine position." Eisenhower rubbed his forehead, the weight of command etched deeper into his face. He trusted Patton's tactical genius more than most, but he also remembered Sicily, the slapping incidents, the near relief after the Knutsford speech. One miscalculation now, at the war's climax, could cost thousands of lives and fracture the coalition. On the front lines, the human reality of the advance played out in small, brutal moments. Lieutenant Tom Harlan's platoon from the 5th Infantry Division crept forward through a pine forest south of Mainz under cover of darkness. The ground was carpeted with wet needles that muffled their steps, but every snapped twig sounded like a gunshot in the silence. German machine guns opened up without warning, tracers whipping through the trees like angry hornets. Harlan's men hit the dirt, returning fire blindly into the dark. The air filled with the sharp crack of rifles, the deeper thud of grenades, and the screams of the wounded. When dawn came, pale and gray, they counted 3 dead and 5 wounded for the gain of a few hundred yards of muddy woodland. Harlan knelt beside a young private from Iowa, pressing a bandage against a chest wound that bubbled with every breath. The boy's eyes were wide with fear. "Tell my ma I did okay, sir," he whispered before going limp. Harlan closed the eyes gently, then stood and waved his platoon forward. There was no time to grieve. Patton's orders were to keep moving. Farther south, the 4th Armored Division's tanks ground along a narrow road flanked by flooded fields. German 88mm guns hidden in village ruins took their toll, knocking out 3 Shermans in quick succession. Flames shot skyward, black smoke billowing as crews bailed out and ran for cover. The surviving tanks replied with high explosive shells that demolished stone houses and sent debris raining down. Mud splattered the turrets, clogging vision slits and forcing commanders to fight buttoned up, blind, except for periscopes. Radio traffic crackled with urgency. "This is Red Leader, taking heavy fire from the church steeple. Request immediate smoke." The battlefield became a chaos of roaring engines, exploding shells, and the constant grinding fear that the next round had your name on it. Patton received these reports in his command trailer, face grim as casualty figures mounted. He knew the cost of speed, knew it intimately from 30 years of war, but he also believed the cost of hesitation would be higher. Still, doubt crept in during the quiet moments. Am I pushing them too hard? Will Ike shut me down? He paced the narrow confines of the trailer, boots thudding on the wooden floor, mind racing through contingencies. If the answer from Schaeff was negative, he would have to halt at the river, consolidate, and watch Montgomery take the glory. The thought burned like acid. Walker arrived late that evening, mud to his knees, helmet tucked under one arm. "We're within 5 miles of the river, General. Recon boats are already probing for crossing sites. The men are ready." Patton studied his loyal subordinate, seeing the same exhaustion mirrored in Walker's eyes that he felt in his own bones. "And if Ike says no?" Walker shrugged. "Then we obey, but I'll be damned if we don't give him every reason to say yes." That night, Patton wrote in his diary by lantern light, "The opportunity is slipping away with every hour. The Germans know we're coming now. They'll blow every bridge they can. If we wait for the perfect plan, the war will drag into summer and thousands more will die for nothing." He closed the leather-bound book and stared at the canvas ceiling, listening to rain drums steadily overhead. At the front, soldiers dug shallow scrapes in the cold earth, trying to find a dry spot that didn't exist. They shared cigarettes and rumors that Patton was going to cross the river any day now, that the war would be over by Easter, that the Germans were finished. Fear mingled with hope in equal measure. No one wanted to be the last man killed in a war that felt so close to ending. Back at Schaeff, Eisenhower made his decision but held it close, consulting Bradley one final time. The clock ticked relentlessly. Every minute of hesitation strengthened the German hand, however weakly they could still hold it. Patton waited for the answer that would either unleash him or chain him to doctrine forever. He knew hesitation could cost lives, yet speed carried its own deadly risk. By the evening of March 22, 1945, elements of Patton's Third Army had reached the west bank of the Rhine, south of Mainz. The river stretched before them like a gray steel ribbon under a low, threatening sky, wide, swift, and cold. From the bluffs near Oppenheim and Nierstein, American soldiers looked across to the far bank through binoculars, searching for movement in the vineyards and scattered villages. The east bank appeared strangely quiet. No heavy concentrations of troops, no visible artillery emplacements, only occasional patrols and a few half-hearted machine gun nests. It was the kind of quiet that felt too good to be true. Patton arrived at the forward command post of the 5th Infantry Division just after dusk. His jeep skidded to a halt on the muddy track, splashing water onto the waiting officers. He stepped out without ceremony, helmet tucked under one arm, and strode toward the observation point, a ruined farmhouse overlooking the river. General Walton Walker was already there, pointing out landmarks on a grease-stained map spread across the hood of a jeep. "We've got assault boats hidden in the woods downstream," Walker said without preamble. "Engineers have scrounged enough storm boats and rafts for 2 battalions to go across tonight. If we launch at SO 200, we can have a foothold before Jerry wakes up." Patton stared across the water, eyes narrowed. The Rhine was in flood, swollen by melting snow and spring rains, its current running fast enough to sweep a man or a boat far downstream in minutes. No bridges remained intact in the sector. The Germans had blown them methodically as they retreated. Crossing would have to be by small boat in darkness, under whatever fire the enemy could bring to bear. Once across, the infantry would be isolated, no armor, no heavy weapons, no immediate resupply, until pontoon bridges or ferries could be established. It was exactly the kind of high-stakes gamble doctrine warned against. "Show me the exact spot," Patton said. Walker led him down a slippery path to a concealed assembly area where engineers and infantrymen worked in near silence. Dozens of black rubber assault boats lay stacked under camouflage netting. Soldiers checked paddles, tested outboard motors, and loaded ammunition crates with practiced efficiency. The air smelled of wet canvas, gasoline, and nervous sweat. Lieutenant Tom Harlan's platoon was among those selected for the first wave. Harlan moved among his men, speaking in low tones, checking that each soldier carried extra grenades and bandages. Faces were pale in the dim light of shielded flashlights. No one spoke of fear, but it hung heavy all the same. At 0200 on March 23rd, the crossing began. The night was pitch black, clouds obscuring the moon. The first boats slid silently into the water, paddles dipping without a splash. Engines were held in reserve. Noise was the enemy now. Harlan's boat was in the second wave. He sat in the bow, rifle across his knees, heart pounding as the current seized them almost immediately. The far bank was a dark smudge against darker sky. Halfway across, a German flare burst overhead, bathing the river in harsh white light. Machine guns opened up from the east bank. Tracers stitched red lines across the water. Boats slewed sideways as men paddled frantically for the far shore. One boat took a direct burst. Screams echoed over the water as it capsized, men thrashing in the icy current. Harlan's boat grounded hard on a gravel bar. His men spilled out, splashing through knee-deep water, and sprinted for cover among the willows lining the bank. Return fire cracked from American rifles and bars. The Germans, caught by surprise, fired wildly at first, then with more accuracy as they manned their positions. Casualties mounted quickly. Men hit in the open, bodies floating downstream in the current. But the surprise was total. By dawn, 2 battalions of the 5th Infantry Division held a shallow lodgment on the east bank, digging in furiously under sporadic mortar fire. Patton monitored the operation from the West Bank command post, face impassive as radio reports came in. First wave across, resistance light but increasing. Then, second established, request immediate smoke and artillery support. He turned to Walker. Get the engineers moving on a pontoon bridge. We need armor across by tonight, or this bridgehead dies. Walker nodded and began issuing orders, voice calm despite the urgency. The crisis came at midday. German commanders on the east bank finally grasped what was happening and reacted with whatever forces they had at hand. A battered Kampfgruppe of infantry, a few self-propelled guns, and a company of panzer grenadiers rushed south from Mainz. They launched a sharp counterattack against the American lodgment, just as engineers began assembling the first pontoon sections on the West Bank. From Lieutenant Harlan's perspective on the East Bank, the situation deteriorated rapidly. His platoon held a stretch of riverbank behind a low stone wall. German infantry advanced across open fields, supported by 2 assault guns that rumbled forward, firing point-blank into American positions. Shells exploded in geysers of earth and stone, the air filled with the acrid smell of high explosive and the screams of wounded men. Ammunition ran low, soldiers scavenged clips from the dead. Harlan directed fire from behind the wall, shouting encouragement as tracers whipped overhead. "Hold the line! Armor's coming!" But no armor could come yet. The river remained uncrossed by anything heavier than a jeep. Back on the West Bank, disaster loomed. The pontoon bridge site selected by the engineers was under direct observation from German positions on a low ridge. As the first sections were floated into place, accurate artillery and mortar fire began to fall. One shell scored a direct hit on a pontoon raft loaded with treadway sections. The explosion sent steel and timber skyward, killing several engineers instantly. The current swept the damaged sections downstream, tangling lines and halting progress. A second bridge attempt farther downstream bogged down when approach roads turned into impassable mud under the weight of heavy trucks. Patton arrived at the bridging site in person, jeep fishtailing through churned earth. He stood exposed on the bank, binoculars to his eyes, watching smoke rise from the east bank where Harlan's men fought for survival. Radio traffic crackled with desperation. Bridgehead under heavy counterattack, needs support now, ammunition critical. Walker reported grimly that the pontoon effort was hours behind schedule. German fire had knocked out 2 more rafts. Engineers worked under direct fire, casualties mounting. For the first time, doubt showed openly on Patton's face. He had gambled everything on speed and surprise. If the bridgehead collapsed before heavy weapons crossed, the entire operation would fail catastrophically. Divisions mauled, Eisenhower's caution vindicated, and Patton himself likely relieved. Soldiers on both banks fought with the knowledge that failure meant annihilation or capture. Harlan's platoon was down to 20 effectives, holding a shrinking perimeter as German infantry closed in. Then, in the late afternoon, a small miracle occurred. Combat engineers under Captain George P. Hill found an alternate site slightly upstream, partially concealed by a bend in the river and screened by smoke generators. Working at breakneck speed under covering fire from tanks on the west bank, they launched the first pontoons. German artillery shifted, but too late. The first section locked into place. One by one, the spans extended across the racing current. The first Sherman tank rumbled onto the treadway just as dusk fell, its engine roaring defiance. On the east bank, the sound of American armor carried across the water like salvation. Harlan's men cheered hoarsely as the lead tanks fanned out, guns traversing toward the German counterattack. The tide turned in minutes. German infantry wavered, then retreated under the hammer of 76mm shells. Patton watched the tanks cross, face unreadable. He knew how close it had come. One delayed raft, one accurate shell, 1 hour more of hesitation, and the gamble would have been history, literally. As darkness settled over the Rhine on the evening of March 23, 1945, the pontoon bridge at Nierstein finally held firm. Sherman tanks rumbled across the swaying treadway sections one after another, their tracks clanging against the steel plates, while engineers worked frantically with blowtorches and cables to reinforce the structure against the relentless pull of the current. Headlights pierced the gloom, casting long shadows on the water as more vehicles followed. Half-tracks, trucks loaded with ammunition, jeeps towing anti-tank guns. On the east bank, the arrival of armor turned the desperate defense into a solid lodgment. Lieutenant Tom Harlan watched the tanks fan out from his forward position, their turrets traversing toward the retreating Germans. For the first time in hours, his men allowed themselves exhausted smiles. The bridgehead had survived its baptism of fire. Patton stood on the west bank overlook, coat collar turned up against the cold wind whipping off the river. He watched the column cross with the intensity of a man who had just stared into the abyss and stepped back from the edge. General Walton Walker joined him, offering a terse report. "Bridge is taking full traffic now, sir. Combat Command A of the 4th Armored is across and pushing inland. Resistance is crumbling fast." Patton nodded once, but his eyes remained fixed on the far shore. The near disaster had shaken even him. One more hour of delay, one more accurate German barrage, and the entire operation would have collapsed into bloody failure. He knew it, Walker knew it, and soon Eisenhower would know it. The message from Schaeff that Patton had been waiting for finally arrived just after midnight. It came not as a direct cable to 3rd Army headquarters, but through General Omar Bradley at 12th Army Group, a deliberate buffer that allowed Eisenhower to maintain deniability if things went wrong. Bradley's voice crackled over the secure field telephone in Patton's command trailer, the connection hissing with static. "George, Ike has read your proposal. He's not happy about the timing or the supply implications, but he's not stopping you either." His exact words, "Tell Patton to go ahead if he thinks he can pull it off. But for God's sake, don't let him get cut off over there. No additional bridging equipment or fuel priority will be diverted from Montgomery yet. You're on your own until the situation clarifies." Patton listened in silence, pipe unlit between his teeth. It was not the enthusiastic endorsement he had hoped for, but it was the answer he needed, permission wrapped in caution, freedom hedged with responsibility. Eisenhower had bent doctrine without breaking it entirely. The Supreme Commander trusted Patton's judgment one more time. But the burden of success or failure remained squarely on 3rd Army's shoulders. Patton's response was characteristically brief. "Tell Ike we're already across and moving fast. He'll have his bridgehead and more by morning." He hung up the receiver and turned to his staff with renewed fire in his eyes. Orders flew thick and fast. The 4th Armored Division was to exploit immediately, driving east and southeast to widen the breach before German High Command could organize a coherent response. The 90th Infantry Division would follow to secure the flanks. Engineers were to throw a second, heavier bridge across at Oppenheim by dawn to handle the flood of traffic that would soon follow. Speed remained everything. The window of German disorganization would not stay open long. On the East Bank, the effect of Eisenhower's tacit approval rippled outward like a shockwave. Soldiers who had fought all day with the grim certainty of isolation now sensed victory within reach. Harlan's platoon, reinforced by fresh companies, pushed inland through darkened villages where German defenders surrendered at the first sight of American tanks. House-to-house fighting flared briefly in some places, muzzle flashes lighting stone facades, grenades bursting in narrow streets, but the will to resist was breaking. Prisoners streamed rearward in long columns, hands raised, faces blank with exhaustion and defeat. Patton crossed the river himself shortly after dawn on March 24th, jeep bouncing over the pontoons while military policemen waved him through. He stood erect in the open vehicle, ignoring the cold spray kicked up by the tires, eyes scanning the east bank as if memorizing every detail. When he reached the far side, he stepped out onto German soil east of the Rhine and paused for a long moment. Then, in a gesture witnessed by dozens of grinning soldiers and captured on film by an army cameraman, he bent down, scooped a handful of earth, and let it run through his fingers. "Montgomery won't be across for days yet," he said loudly enough for nearby troops to hear. "Tell the world Third Army beat him to it." The advance accelerated. By midday, armored spearheads were 10 miles inland, bypassing pockets of resistance and capturing key road junctions. German commands scrambled to respond, shifting units south from the Ruhr and ordering frantic demolitions of bridges farther east. But they were too late. The Rhine line had been pierced at its weakest point, and the breach was widening by the hour. Fuel and ammunition, though still short, were rushed forward by every available truck. Red Ball Express drivers pushed their vehicles to the limit along muddy roads, headlights blazing through the night to keep the momentum alive. At Schaef, Eisenhower received the first reports of the successful crossing with a mixture of relief and quiet exasperation. He lit another cigarette and studied the situation map as grease pencil arrows showed Third Army's unexpected bridgehead expanding rapidly. Montgomery's staff reacted with predictable indignation, cabling complaints about disrupted supply schedules. Eisenhower overruled them calmly. "Patton has forced the issue," he told his chief of staff. "Now we support success." Orders went out redirecting some bridging equipment and air support southward, belated but enough to solidify the gain. Patton drove the exploitation without mercy. Late on March 24th, he met with his corps commanders in a requisitioned German Gasthaus east of the river, maps spread across a long oak table still set with abandoned coffee cups. "We don't stop," he told them flatly. "Not for rest, not for supplies, not for anything. The enemy is reeling, we keep him that way." Walker and the others nodded, knowing the pace would cost lives and machines, but also knowing hesitation would cost more. By the evening of March 25th, the bridgehead was 20 miles deep and growing. German attempts at counterattacks collapsed under concentrated American artillery and airstrikes. Towns fell one after another, Darmstadt, Frankfurt within reach. The psychological impact spread faster than the tanks. German soldiers surrendered in ever larger groups, convinced the end had come. Patton allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction as he stood on a hill overlooking the expanding salient at dusk. The Rhine lay behind him now, no longer a barrier, but a conquered obstacle. Eisenhower's answer, cautious, qualified, but ultimately permissive, had reshaped the entire final campaign. Doctrine had bent under the pressure of audacity and timing. The answer arrived, and with it the fragile line between brilliance and catastrophe. By the end of March 1945, the Rhine barrier lay shattered behind Patton's Third Army. What had begun as a fragile, improvised bridgehead near Oppenheim had exploded into a broad salient thrusting deep into central Germany. Armored columns raced eastward along autobahns and country roads, outpacing their maps and overwhelming scattered German resistance. Towns and cities that had expected weeks of preparation for defense fell in hours. Darmstadt on March 25th, Frankfurt on March 26th. The 4th Armored Division sliced through Hessian plains like a hot knife, capturing intact bridges over the main river and bagging thousands of prisoners who seemed almost relieved to surrender. The speed was dizzying, almost disorienting. Supply officers scrambled to keep up, fuel trucks driving through the night with headlights blazing to feed the insatiable advance. Patton moved with his spearheads, jeep bouncing over shell-pocked roads, stopping frequently to confer with tank commanders or harangue stragglers forward. His presence was electric. Soldiers cheered when they saw the familiar 3-star plate on the bumper, the polished helmet, the unmistakable silhouette standing tall in the open vehicle. Morale soared. The war felt suddenly winnable, almost over. In one captured town square, Patton addressed a crowd of grinning GIs from the hood of his jeep. "We've crossed the Rhine ahead of schedule and ahead of everybody else," he declared, voice carrying over the rumble of idling engines. "Now we don't stop until we reach the Elbe, or hell, whichever comes first." The men roared approval, exhaustion forgotten in the rush of victory. At Chafe, Eisenhower monitored the unfolding triumph with a complex mixture of emotions. Patton's audacity had forced his hand, turning a potential sideshow into the decisive stroke of the Western campaign. Montgomery's meticulously planned crossing at Wesel on March 24, complete with airborne drops and massive barrages, now seemed almost anticlimactic, a secondary effort overshadowed by Third Army's lightning exploitation. Supplies were hastily redirected south. Air support shifted priorities. Eisenhower sent a terse but congratulatory message through Bradley. "Tell George he's done it again. Keep pushing, but watch the flanks." Privately, he knew the political cost. British pride stung, coalition harmony strained, but military reality trumped everything. The war would end sooner because one general had asked a dangerous question and refused to wait for perfect conditions. The human cost of that speed became visible in the aftermath. Hospitals filled with wounded from the initial crossing and the relentless advance that followed. Lieutenant Tom Harlan, promoted to captain on the field for holding his sector during the counterattack, visited a field hospital near Frankfurt. Rows of cots stretched under canvas, filled with bandaged men, burn victims from brewed-up tanks, shrapnel cases, frostbite from the river crossing. The air smelled of antiseptic, blood, and cigarette smoke. Harlan sat beside a sergeant from his old platoon, leg amputated below the knee. "Worth it, sir?" the man asked quietly. Harlan thought of the miles gained, the prisoners taken, the war shortened. "Yeah," he answered finally, "it was worth it." But the words tasted hollow even as he spoke them. Patton himself felt the paradox most acutely. In the quiet of a requisitioned manor house east of the Rhine, he sat alone one evening with a captured bottle of cognac and his diary. The entry was uncharacteristically reflective. "We have achieved a great victory through boldness and speed, yet I cannot escape the knowledge that it might have ended in catastrophe. A few more shells on the pontoons, a stronger counterattack, and Third Army would have been ruined. Genius and folly are separated by the thinnest margin." He closed the book and stared out the window at the distant glow of campfires. Success had vindicated him completely. Eisenhower's caution overridden, Montgomery upstaged, the Rhine turned from barrier to highway. Yet the near disaster haunted him. War rewarded the gambler, but only if the dice landed right. The symbolic object that encapsulated the entire episode was the pontoon bridge itself, the fragile treadway at Nierstein that had swayed under the weight of tanks while German shells burst nearby. Army engineers later reinforced it into a permanent structure. But in those first critical hours, it had been little more than steel sections and hope, held together by rope, sweat, and timing. Photographs of Sherman tanks crossing it became iconic, reproduced in newspapers across the Allied world. For the men who built and defended it, the bridge represented the razor edge between triumph and disaster, a literal thin wire stretched across a raging river. In the weeks that followed, Third Army continued its drive across Germany, linking up with other forces encircling the Ruhr pocket, racing toward Czechoslovakia. The war in Europe ended on May 8th, sooner than many planners had dared predict. Historians would later argue that Patton's Rhine crossing shortened the conflict by weeks, saving thousands of lives on both sides, even as it cost hundreds in the immediate fighting. The legacy proved contradictory, as great victories often are. Patton's audacity became legend. a textbook example of initiative and exploitation taught at war colleges for generations. Yet the same episode reinforced caution in equal measure. The near failure at the bridge served as a warning of what happened when doctrine was ignored without overwhelming preparation. Eisenhower, in his post-war writings, praised Patton's achievement while subtly criticizing the risk. Montgomery never forgave the upstaging. Soldiers who served under Patton remembered both the glory and the exhaustion, the thrill of speed and the price paid for it. The deeper moral paradox endured. Success had proven that a single bold question, asked at the right moment, could topple months of careful planning and change the course of a campaign. It validated instinct over committee, action over hesitation. Yet it also demonstrated how perilously close brilliance lay to catastrophe, how one man's genius could have become another's folly with only a slight shift in timing or luck. Lieutenant, now Captain, Harlan survived the war and returned home to a quiet life in the Midwest. Years later, when asked about Patton, he would pause before answering. "He got us across the Rhine and helped end the war quick," he'd say. "But I still dream about that bridge sometimes, how it shook under the tanks, how close it came to going under. Courage isn't just charging ahead. Sometimes it's knowing the wire you're walking might snap." Patton himself met his end only months after victory, in a mundane car accident far from any battlefield. His last campaign remained his finest hour and his sharpest lesson, that in war, speed and audacity could conquer rivers and armies, but the line between genius and disaster was always thinner than a wire on a bridge. In war, a single question can topple doctrine, defy caution, and change history, but the line between genius and disaster is thinner than a wire on a bridge. If you believe the moments that define history deserve cinematic storytelling, subscribe for more untold World War II brilliance.